Someone asks you for a favor you do not have the time for, and before your rational mind has even finished registering the request, the word yes is already leaving your mouth. Of course, no problem. Happy to help. You hear yourself say it with a warmth that sounds completely genuine, and in a sense, it is genuine, because some part of you truly does want to help. But underneath that warmth, in a much quieter register, another voice is already groaning, already calculating the hours you do not have, already resenting a request you have not even finished agreeing to. That second voice almost never makes it to your mouth. It stays exactly where it has always stayed, buried, silent, and slowly accumulating, one small yes at a time, into something that eventually starts to feel less like generosity and more like a low grade. Chronic exhaustion you cannot quite name. If this pattern sounds familiar, you are not simply a kind person with poor time management. You are living inside one of the most common and most quietly corrosive psychological traps that Gustav Jung ever described. A trap built entirely out of the mask he called the persona, the socially acceptable face a person constructs to meet the world. And in this particular case, a very specific and very seductive version of that mask. The good person, the reliable one, the one who never causes trouble, the one who can always be counted on to say yes. This script is going to take that single, deceptively small difficulty, the inability to say no, and trace it all the way down to its roots. We will look at exactly how the good person persona gets built in childhood, and why it feels from the inside less like a choice and more like a moral obligation you would be a bad person for violating. We will bring in Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment, the slow poisoning of the soul that occurs when a person continually swallows their own anger rather than expressing it. And we will look at how directly that concept maps onto the specific experience of chronic, silent resentment toward people you have never once told no. We will bring in Alfred Adler's blunt insistence that psychological freedom requires the courage to be disliked, and Erich Fromm's warning about what he called automaton conformity, the process by which a person trades their authentic self for social approval, so completely that they eventually lose access to what they even want in the first place. We will look at the ancient myth of Echo, a story that turns out to be one of the most precise metaphors for this exact condition that classical mythology has ever produced. And finally, we will walk through a concrete, usable set of practices for reclaiming your own voice. Practices Jung himself developed specifically for locating and integrating exactly the kind of suppressed material that a lifetime of reflexive yes has buried by the end. The discomfort of disappointing someone will not disappear, because it was never actually the problem. The problem was mistaking a costume for your own skin. Consider how strange it is that this particular difficulty so rarely gets named directly for what it is. We have an entire cultural vocabulary for being too aggressive, too selfish, too difficult, but almost no equally developed vocabulary for the opposite failure. For a person so thoroughly organized around the needs and expectations of others that their own preferences have become genuinely difficult for them to locate. This asymmetry is not an accident. A culture built on continuous availability, continuous helpfulness, and continuous accommodation has very little incentive to examine the psychological cost of producing exactly the kind of person who never causes friction, precisely because that person is, by design, remarkably convenient to everyone around them, except themselves. Jung's concept of the persona was never meant to describe villainy or falseness in any dramatic sense. It describes something far more ordinary and, for that reason, far harder to see clearly. The mask a person constructs to meet the specific expectations of their family and their culture. A mask that in most cases begins forming so early in childhood that by adulthood it feels less like a mask than like the person's actual face. For a very large number of people, especially those raised in households where love and approval were, consciously or not, made conditional on being easy. Being helpful, being good, the specific persona that forms is what we might call the good one. A self-image built entirely around never being a burden, never causing conflict, and never disappointing anyone who asks something of you. The construction of this particular persona usually begins with a very simple, very early piece of learning. A child quickly discovers, often before they have the verbal capacity to articulate it even to themselves, that certain behaviors reliably produce warmth, approval, and safety from caregivers, while other behaviors, particularly the expression of one's own competing needs, resistance or refusal, reliably produce tension, withdrawal of affection, or open conflict. A child raised in a household where a parent responds to the word no with anger, guilt, disappointment, or emotional withdrawal learns an extremely durable lesson: that their own preferences are dangerous to express, and that safety and love are purchased specifically through compliance. This is not a conscious, articulated belief system. It is closer to a body-level conditioning, laid down long before the prefrontal cortex is developed enough to question it, and it becomes, in Jung's language, the specific shape of that child's persona, the good one, the easy one, the one who never says no. It is worth pausing here on the evolutionary and physiological substrate of this pattern, because it helps explain why saying no can feel, in the moment, less like a simple social choice and more like a genuine threat to survival. Attachment researchers have documented what is sometimes called the fawn response, a nervous system strategy that sits alongside the more widely known fight, flight, and freeze responses, where fight and flight mobilize the body to confront or escape a threat, and freeze shuts the body down entirely. Fawning mobilizes the body toward appeasement, toward pleasing and placating whatever is perceived as a source of danger. In a child dependent entirely on a caregiver for survival, fawning in response to that caregiver's displeasure is not a character flaw. It is a highly adaptive strategy. Since a small child genuinely cannot survive the withdrawal of a parent's care, and appeasement is often the fastest available route back to safety, the difficulty arises when this childhood survival strategy, wired in at a moment when it was genuinely life-preserving, continues operating unconsciously into adulthood, long after the actual physical dependency it justified it has ended. The adult who cannot say no to a colleague, a friend, or a family member is very often running exactly this ancient appeasement circuitry, experiencing a request from another person as carrying a faint but genuine echo of that original childhood danger. Even though the actual stakes of a modern refusal are almost never remotely comparable. It is worth noting that this fawn response often coexists with, and can be mistaken for, genuine empathy and kindness, which is part of what makes it so difficult to recognize from the inside. A person operating from authentic generosity offers help because they have consciously weighed the request against their own capacity and genuinely wish to give. A person operating from fawning offers help because refusal registers, at a nervous system level, as unsafe, regardless of their actual capacity or genuine wish. From the outside, these two motivations can look identical. The same warm smile, the same immediate yes. But internally, they carry entirely different costs, one sustainable and freely chosen, the other slowly depleting and compulsory in a way the person offering it rarely consciously recognizes. Jung, writing decades before this attachment research existed, arrived at a closely related insight through his study of persona formation. He observed that a persona built primarily around meeting the expectations of others, rather than expressing the authentic contours of the individual underneath it, tends to become increasingly rigid over time, precisely because any deviation from it feels, to the person wearing it, like a threat to their fundamental sense of safety and belonging. This is why so many people who struggle to say no describe the experience not simply as social awkwardness, but as something closer to genuine fear, a felt sense that saying no risks something catastrophic, even when the rational mind can see clearly that nothing catastrophic is actually at stake. There is an important gendered dimension worth naming here as well. Since the good persona does not fall evenly across every person raised within a given culture, girls across a wide range of societies have historically been socialized more intensively toward accommodation, caretaking, and emotional attunement to others, while boys have often been permitted, even encouraged, a wider latitude for direct refusal and open assertion of their own preferences. This is not a universal or absolute pattern, and men experience their own version of the good persona trap, often organized instead around never appearing weak or in need, which produces its own distinct difficulty in saying no to demands framed around toughness or obligation. But the specific difficulty of the reflexive, compulsive yes does appear across a great deal of clinical and survey research, with disproportionate frequency among women, a pattern best explained not by any innate difference in temperament, but by a difference in the specific conditioning each gender has historically received about which of their own preferences are permitted open expression. Jung's broader theory of psychic energy. Economics adds another important layer here. Every yes given against one's actual preference, every accommodation made at the expense of one's own genuine needs, draws on a finite reserve of psychic energy, in exactly the same way that persona maintenance more generally draws down that same reserve. A person who has spent years, sometimes decades, continuously overriding their own preferences in favor of the good persona's demands is, in Jung's framework, running a chronic energy deficit, one that frequently manifests as the vague, hard-to-name exhaustion so many chronic people-pleasers describe, a fatigue that rest alone does not seem to fix. Because the depletion is not physical but psychic, the ongoing cost of a self that is rarely permitted to actually show up as itself. Friedrich Nietzsche, writing several decades before Jung, developed a concept that maps onto this exact phenomenon with striking precision: ressentiment, a term he deliberately borrowed from French to capture something distinct from ordinary resentment. For Nietzsche, ressentiment describes the specific psychological poison that accumulates in a person who repeatedly suppresses a hostile or resentful reaction rather than expressing it outwardly, because they judge themselves too weak, too dependent, or too morally constrained to express it directly. Rather than dissipating, Nietzsche argued, this suppressed hostility turns inward and ferments, gradually souring the person's entire relationship to themselves and to the world, often expressing itself eventually not as honest anger, but as a kind of chronic, low-grade bitterness, passive aggression, or an exaggerated, performative virtuousness that quietly punishes others for the compliance the resentful person feels they themselves were never permitted. This concept translates almost perfectly onto the psychology of chronic yes-saying. The colleague who says yes to every request and then complains bitterly about their workload to everyone, except the person who actually made the request. The family member who agrees to every obligation and then punishes everyone around them with a barely concealed martyred sigh. The friend who never directly refuses an invitation, but who cancels at the last minute, or shows up late, or is quietly cold throughout the entire event they never actually wanted to attend. In every one of these cases, Nietzsche's ressentiment offers a precise diagnostic vocabulary, an anger that was never permitted a direct, honest expression, finding an indirect, corrosive one instead, poisoning relationships that an honest no, offered at the right moment, would actually have protected. Nietzsche was particularly interested in how ressentiment eventually distorts a person's entire value system, not merely their mood in any given moment. He observed that a person carrying enough unexpressed resentment often begins, without quite realizing it, to develop an active contempt for precisely the qualities they themselves lack the courage to display. Contempt for people who set boundaries easily, dismissed as selfish or cold. Contempt for people who pursue their own desires openly, dismissed as arrogant or self-absorbed. This inversion allows the resentful person to feel morally superior to the very behavior that would actually relieve their own suffering. A bitter irony Nietzsche considered one of the most self-defeating psychological patterns a person can fall into, since it forecloses, through moral judgment, the exact behavior that could set them free. Nietzsche's broader concept of slave morality versus master morality adds further depth here. For Nietzsche, slave morality arises among those who feel structurally powerless to act directly on their own desires and instead develop an elaborate moral framework that redefines their own compliance and self-denial as virtue, while quietly condemning the confident, boundary-setting behavior of others as selfishness or arrogance. A person operating from this framework does not merely fail to say no. They have constructed an entire internal moral architecture in which saying no would feel like a genuine ethical violation, a failure of goodness itself, rather than simply an ordinary act of self-respect. This is precisely why so many chronic people-pleasers report that the thought of refusing a request produces not mild discomfort, but genuine guilt, as though they were contemplating something actually wrong, rather than something entirely within their rights. Alfred Adler, a contemporary of both Freud and Jung, approached this same territory with characteristic bluntness. Adler argued that psychological health requires what he called the courage to be disliked, an explicit acknowledgement that living according to one's own authentic values will inevitably, and correctly, disappoint some people some of the time, and that a person unwilling to tolerate that disappointment has effectively handed control of their own life over to whoever is most willing to express displeasure. For Adler, the compulsive need for universal approval is not a virtue but a specific neurotic pattern, one rooted in an inflated, almost magical belief that it is actually possible and morally required to manage everyone else's feelings about you at all times. Adler's concept of social interest, a genuine, healthy concern for the well-being of others, is explicitly distinguished in his work from this compulsive approval-seeking, precisely because genuine social interest can tolerate another person's temporary disappointment, while compulsive approval-seeking experiences that same disappointment as an emergency, requiring immediate correction. Adler went so far as to argue that a great deal of what passes for kindness in an ordinary social life is, on closer inspection, a disguised form of anxiety management, behavior organized not around the genuine welfare of the other person, but around the anxious relief of the giver, who fears the internal consequences of being seen as unhelpful, far more than they actually weigh the merits of the request itself. This is not a cynical dismissal of kindness as such. Adler believed deeply in genuine social interest as a cornerstone of psychological health, but a careful, clinically useful distinction between kindness freely chosen and compliance anxiously extracted, a distinction that becomes considerably easier to make once you have honestly examined which of the two is actually driving your own reflexive yes.sore, and Kierkegaard's concept of the crowd is untruth, which we have touched on in other contexts, applies here with particular force. A person who has organized their entire behavior around never disappointing anyone has, in Kierkegaard's terms, effectively dissolved their own individual judgment into an anxious, continuous monitoring of collective opinion, never quite able to locate their own authentic preference beneath the constant calculation of what everyone else wants from them. Kierkegaard's demand that the individual take responsibility for becoming their own self rather than a reflection of collective expectation is in this context not an abstract philosophical position, but an intensely practical one, since a person who cannot say no has, in the most literal sense, not yet fully become a self-distinct from the sum of other people's expectations of them. Kierkegaard offers a further useful distinction here between what he called the aesthetic and the ethical relationship to obligation. A person operating aesthetically toward their commitments says yes because saying yes is pleasant in the moment, avoiding the immediate discomfort of disappointing someone without genuinely weighing the longer-term cost to themselves or the relationship. A person operating ethically toward the same commitments has actually considered the request against their own genuine capacity and values, and their eventual yes or no reflects the considered judgment rather than a reflexive avoidance of momentary discomfort. The shift Kierkegaard calls for, from the aesthetic to the ethical stage of existence, maps with real precision onto the shift this script is describing, from a persona driven by the avoidance of immediate social discomfort toward a self capable of genuine, weighed commitment, including the commitment, when appropriate, to refuse. Erich Fromm, writing in the shadow of European totalitarianism, developed a concept in Escape from Freedom that adds a crucial social and even political dimension to this psychological pattern. Fromm described what he called automaton conformity, a process by which an individual, overwhelmed by the anxiety and responsibility that come with genuine freedom and individual judgment, unconsciously trades their authentic self for a manufactured, socially approved identity, adopting the opinions, preferences, and behaviors that will most reliably secure belonging and approval. Fromm's genuinely unsettling observation is that this trait is rarely experienced by the person making it as a loss, because the automaton conformist has, over time, lost meaningful access to whatever authentic preferences existed before the conformity began, making the entire process largely invisible from the inside. Fromm connected this specific psychological mechanism to much larger social and political phenomena, arguing that a population composed largely of automaton conformists, individuals who have traded authentic selfhood for the anxiety, relieving comfort of blending seamlessly into collective expectation, become structurally vulnerable to authoritarian movements that offer an even more complete escape from the burden of individual judgment. While the stakes of an individual's inability to say no to a colleague are obviously nowhere near this scale, Fromm's underlying mechanism is identical. The anxiety of individual responsibility relieved through submission to an external authority, whether that authority is a demanding boss, an entitled family member, or a mass political movement. Recognizing this shared root can be clarifying, since it reframes the seemingly small personal difficulty of saying no as one local instance of a psychological pattern with genuinely large-scale consequences when it operates at a societal level. A person who has spent decades saying yes to nearly everything may, by midlife, have genuinely lost track of what they themselves actually want in a great many domains of their life. Not because those preferences never existed, but because they were never given enough oxygen to remain legible, even to the person carrying them. The Greek myth of Echo offers what may be the single most precise mythological image available for this exact condition. In the myth, Echo is a nymph cursed by Hera, condemned to being able to speak only by repeating the final words that someone else has just said, permanently stripped of the capacity to originate her own speech. Echo can respond, she can reflect, she can amplify, but she can never initiate, never introduce a thought or a refusal of her own into a conversation. When she falls in love with Narcissus, she is left in the devastating position of being unable to tell him so in her own words, able only to echo back fragments of what he himself has already said, until eventually she wastes away entirely, leaving behind nothing but a disembodied voice repeating whatever is spoken to her. Read through a Jungian lens. Echo's condition is an almost unbearably precise portrait of the chronic yes-sayer psychology. Like Echo, a person trapped inside the good persona can respond, can accommodate, can reflect back whatever is asked of them with apparent warmth and fluency, but struggles to originate a genuinely independent no, a statement that does not simply echo the other person's expectation back to them in agreeable form. And like Echo, this condition, sustained long enough, produces a genuine wasting away, not of the body in most cases, but of the felt sense of having an authentic self at all. An inner emptiness that so many chronic people-pleasers eventually describe. The unsettling realization, often arriving only in midlife, that they cannot say with any confidence what they themselves actually want, having spent so many years fluent only in the reflection of what others wanted from them. There is a further layer to the Echo myth worth drawing out. Her curse originates, in most versions of the story, from a punishment for having used her voice deceptively on behalf of someone else, distracting Hera with idle chatter while Zeus pursued other affairs. Read symbolically, Echo's loss of an independent voice follows directly from having used that voice, for a long period, entirely in service of managing someone else's experience rather than expressing her own. This is worth sitting with, because it mirrors precisely the mechanism by which the good persona forms in the first place. A voice trained for so long to manage other people's comfort that it eventually forgets how to say anything else. The Faust legend. Again relevant here as it was in our earlier discussion of the persona more broadly, offers a related warning. Faust's tragedy can be read partly as the tragedy of someone who continually trades pieces of his authentic inner life for external approval and worldly reward, discovering too late that this trade, made incrementally and almost imperceptibly across many small transactions, eventually adds up to something much larger than any single transaction seemed to risk. The chronic yes-sayer's version of this bargain is rarely dramatic or gothic. It is made in dozens of small, almost invisible moments. An agreed-to obligation here, a swallowed objection there, each one individually reasonable, cumulatively catastrophic to the felt sense of having a self with genuine boundaries and genuine preferences. Modern case studies make this pattern easy to recognize in entirely ordinary, contemporary terms. Consider a mid-level employee who has become, over several years, the person everyone in the office knows will say yes to extra projects, to covering shifts, to absorbing tasks that fall outside their actual role, because early on they discovered that this reliability earned them warm feedback and a reputation as a team player. Over time, this same employee finds themselves working far longer hours than colleagues in equivalent roles, increasingly resentful, increasingly exhausted, and crucially, increasingly unable to identify the exact moment they might have said no, since each individual request, viewed in isolation, always seemed too small or too reasonable to refuse. This pattern, sustained over years, produces a form of burnout that looks superficially identical to ordinary occupational burnout, but that a Jungian analysis would trace to something more specific: the chronic suppression of an authentic self beneath a persona built entirely around never being the person who says no. A related and increasingly common modern pathology involves the collapse of boundaries, produced by constant digital availability. Jung himself documented a case bearing directly on this pattern, involving a woman in her 40s who came to him complaining of vague, persistent physical symptoms, digestive trouble, tension headaches, and an unshakable sense of dread that she could not connect any specific cause in her life, which otherwise appeared, by every external measure, stable and successful. Over the course of analysis, Jung discovered that this woman had organized her entire adult identity around being indispensable to everyone around her. Her extended family, her social circle, her professional colleagues, accepting every request for help without exception, and experiencing even the briefest hesitation before agreeing as a source of acute private shame. As the analysis progressed, Jung helped her trace this pattern back to a childhood in which her own mother had modeled and explicitly praised an identical form of self-erasing helpfulness, teaching her, long before she could evaluate the lesson critically, that a woman's worth was measured entirely by her availability to others. Jung's intervention involved gradually helping this patient practice small, deliberately chosen refusals, beginning with the lowest stakes situations available to her. And over a period of months, her physical symptoms notably improved. A change Jung attributed directly to the reduction in chronic psychic strain produced by continuously overriding her own authentic preferences. This case remains one of the clearer illustrations in Jung's clinical record of the direct link between an unintegrated persona built around compulsory helpfulness and genuine physiological symptoms. Symptoms that resolved not through any medical intervention, but through the patient's gradual reclamation of her own capacity to refuse a related and increasingly common modern pathology involves the collapse of boundaries produced by constant digital availability, where earlier generations could plausibly claim they were simply unreachable outside certain hours. Contemporary communication technology has effectively eliminated that excuse, leaving many people feeling obligated to respond immediately to every message, every request, every notification, regardless of the hour or their actual capacity. Precisely because the good persona experiences any delay in response as a small betrayal of its core commitment to being reliable and helpful. This produces a chronic, low-grade activation of exactly the fawn response described earlier, a nervous system perpetually on alert for the next incoming demand, rarely permitted the genuine rest that would allow it to recover. This dynamic has been compounded by workplace cultures that increasingly treat continuous availability as an unspoken marker of commitment and loyalty, so that a person who does eventually attempt to establish reasonable digital boundaries often faces not simply their own internal fawn response, but genuine, if usually unstated, social pressure suggesting that such boundaries reflect insufficient dedication. Navigating this requires a distinction worth making explicit between boundaries that genuinely conflict with the legitimate requirements of a role, which may require negotiation with an employer around structural expectations, and boundaries that only feel unacceptable because the good persona has never been permitted to test them, which are frequently far more available to reclaim, once tested, than they initially appear. That important related pathology is what might be called the excuse trap, a pattern our earlier discussion of the competitor material touched on directly. A person unable to simply say no tends to compensate by attaching an elaborate justification to every refusal. I cannot come because my mother is sick. I cannot lend the money because the car needs repairs, rather than offering a simple, unqualified no. This habit feels in the moment like a kindness, a way of softening the refusal, but it carries a serious hidden cost. Every justification implicitly invites negotiation. If the excuse can be addressed or worked around, the original no no longer holds, and the person who offered it now finds themselves cornered into either accepting help they did not want or further layering additional excuses, each one slightly less credible than the last, until the entire interaction becomes an exhausting, dishonest negotiation rather than a single, clean, respected boundary. There is a further cost to this pattern beyond the immediate negotiation trap, one that operates at the level of the excuse maker's own self-respect. Each fabricated justification is, at some level, a small dishonesty, and a person who repeatedly manufactures reasons rather than simply declining directly is, over time, teaching themselves that their own preference alone is not a sufficient or legitimate basis for a decision. That only external circumstance can justify saying no. This is a corrosive lesson to keep reteaching yourself, because it directly reinforces the very belief that your own wants do not count as valid grounds for action. That produced the difficulty in the first place. The consequence of this pattern, sustained over years, is a specific and corrosive form of self-alienation. Jung would describe this as a growing rift between the persona, the good, agreeable, endlessly accommodating mask, and the shadow, into which every suppressed no, every swallowed objection, every unexpressed irritation has been quietly deposited. This shadow material does not simply disappear. In keeping with the compensation principle discussed extensively elsewhere in Jung's work, it accumulates, and it eventually finds expression through indirect, often destructive channels, passive aggression, unexplained physical tension, sudden and disproportionate outbursts triggered by some minor, unrelated incident that finally exceeds the shadow's capacity for containment or a quiet, pervasive depression rooted in a growing sense that one's entire life has been constructed around everyone's preferences except one's own dot. So what does the path back to an authentic, integrated relationship with your own no actually look like? Jung's model, as before, does not call for demolishing the good persona altogether. Courtesy, reliability, and genuine generosity remain legitimate and valuable qualities. The task, as always in Jung's framework, is conscious integration. Learning to use the good persona as a tool rather than being unconsciously used by it. Retaining the capacity to say yes when yes genuinely reflects your authentic preference, while reclaiming full, unapologetic access to no when it does not. The first and most immediately practical technique is the one our earlier competitor, material gestured toward without quite naming its psychological mechanism correctly. The practice of the unqualified refusal. No is a complete sentence. This does not mean every refusal in your life needs to be delivered coldly or without warmth. It simply means that the refusal itself does not require external justification in order to be valid. Practicing phrases like that does not work for me, or I am not able to take that on right now, without appending a detailed excuse afterward, accomplishes two things simultaneously. It protects you from the negotiation trap described above, and it begins retraining your own nervous system to tolerate the discomfort of a boundary that stands entirely on its own authority, rather than borrowing legitimacy from an external circumstance. The second practice is a specific application of Jung's active imagination technique, aimed directly at locating the suppressed no itself. In a quiet moment, recall a recent situation in which you said yes but felt, underneath the agreement, a flicker of reluctance or resentment. Rather than immediately rationalizing that feeling away, sit with it and ask it directly what it actually wanted to say in that moment. Often what surfaces is strikingly simple and clear. A single sentence a suppressed part of you was fully prepared to say, if only the good persona had permitted it. This exercise does not require you to go back and actually deliver that refusal after the fact. Its value lies in restoring your own conscious access to the authentic preference your persona has been quietly overriding, so that the next time a similar situation arises in real time, you have a far better chance of noticing your true response before the automatic yes takes over. The third practice is a specific and highly targeted form of shadow work, deliberately reclaiming your relationship to your own anger. Many chronic yes-sayers were taught, explicitly or implicitly, that anger itself is dangerous or unacceptable, which is precisely why the ressentiment described earlier has nowhere legitimate to go. A useful practice here involves regularly journaling, without any censorship, about moments of resentment, however small or seemingly petty, specifically asking what boundary was crossed in that moment and what response would have honored your actual feeling rather than the good. Personas demand for continued pleasantness. Over time, this practice restores a working, conscious relationship to your own anger, transforming it from a shameful secret relegated to the shadow into legitimate, useful information about where your genuine boundaries actually lie. It is worth being explicit that reclaiming this relationship to anger does not mean acting on every angry impulse, or becoming someone who expresses irritation freely and without discernment. Jung's model of shadow integration has never been about giving unrestrained expression to previously suppressed material. It is about restoring conscious awareness and choice where there was previously only automatic suppression. A person who has done this work well can feel a flash of irritation at an unreasonable request, recognize it clearly, and then make a genuinely considered decision about how or whether to act on it, rather than either suppressing it entirely as before or discharging it thoughtlessly onto whoever happens to be nearby. The goal is access and choice, not simply venting what was previously buried. The fourth practice involves graduated exposure, deliberately practicing small, low-stakes refusals in situations where the actual social cost of disappointing someone is genuinely minimal. Declining a minor request from a stranger, saying no to a small, non-urgent favor, choosing not to attend a low-stakes social obligation you do not actually want to attend. The goal here is not the specific content of any single refusal, but the cumulative effect of demonstrating to your own nervous system, through direct, repeated experience, that saying no does not in fact produce the catastrophic consequences the old fawn response continues to anticipate. Each successfully tolerated small refusal functions as concrete evidence against that old, outdated threat assessment, gradually recalibrating your baseline sense of how dangerous refusal actually is. It can help enormously to keep a simple, written record of these small experiments, noting the refusal made, the anticipated catastrophe, and the actual outcome. Reviewing this record after several weeks tends to produce a striking and clarifying pattern. An overwhelming majority of anticipated disasters, the friend who will be furious, the colleague who will think less of you, the family member who will withdraw entirely, simply fail to materialize. And where some mild disappointment does occur, it is almost always far smaller and far more survivable than the nervous system's original prediction. This written evidence becomes, over time, a genuinely persuasive counter-argument to the old fawn response, one built not on abstract reassurance, but on your own accumulated, undeniable experience. It is worth choosing your initial practice situations with some care, beginning with the single highest stakes relationship in your life, a demanding parent, a difficult boss, a partner accustomed to unlimited accommodation, is likely to trigger the full intensity of the old fawn response before you have built any evidence to counteract it. And a failed attempt in this context can reinforce the very belief you are trying to dismantle. Far better to begin with situations carrying genuinely low stakes. A stranger's minor request, a low-pressure invitation from an acquaintance, gradually working upward only as your own tolerance and evidence base grow. In much the same way, a person recovering from any other fear works through a hierarchy of gradually increasing exposure rather than confronting the most difficult version of the fear first. The fifth practice is dream analysis, applied specifically to this theme. Since the persona and shadow exist in a compensatory relationship, a person who has spent years suppressing their capacity to refuse often finds this exact tension surfacing in dreams, sometimes as literal images of being trapped, silenced, or unable to speak, sometimes as dreams involving conflict, confrontation, or unexpected assertiveness that feels startling upon waking, precisely because it is so unfamiliar to waking behavior. Keeping a dream journal and paying particular attention to any recurring imagery involving voice, speech, entrapment, or confrontation can offer direct, symbolic insight into how the unconscious is processing this specific imbalance, often revealing the depth of suppressed resentment well before it becomes fully conscious in waking life. A sixth and important practice involves consciously distinguishing, in real time, between requests that call for genuine social interest, in Adler's sense, and requests that are simply testing or exploiting the good persona's reflexive compliance. Before agreeing to any request that arrives with even a flicker of internal reluctance, it helps to introduce a deliberate pause, even a brief one. A single sentence such as "let me check and get back to you," rather than answering immediately. This small delay interrupts the automatic fawn response long enough for a more considered, more authentic answer to have a chance of emerging, and it is often, on its own, sufficient to reveal what your genuine preference actually was underneath the assumption. Reflexive. Yes, it is worth adding an important clarification here, one entirely consistent with Jung's broader model of integration rather than replacement. The goal of this work is not to become someone who says no to everything, trading one rigid, unexamined pattern for its equally rigid opposite. A person who has done this integration while retains full access to genuine generosity, genuine helpfulness, and genuine warmth, offered freely because they actually want to offer it, rather than compulsively because refusal feels unsafe. The difference is not in the frequency of yes and no, it is in the presence, or absence, of genuine conscious choice behind whichever word is actually spoken. So why can you not say no? Because somewhere early in your history, saying no came to feel, at a level far beneath ordinary rational thought, like a threat to your safety and your belonging, and a persona was constructed, quite sensibly given the information available to you at the time, to manage that threat by eliminating refusal almost entirely from your available repertoire of responses. That persona has likely served you well in many respects, earning you real relationships, real trust, and real appreciation from the people around you. But like every persona Jung ever described, it becomes a problem not through its existence, but through your identification with it, through the slow, cumulative loss of access to the authentic self underneath it, the self capable of a clean, unapologetic, unnegotiated no when a no is what the moment actually calls for. There is a real and specific dignity available in reclaiming this capacity, one worth sitting with directly. Echo, trapped forever in her curse, never gets her own voice back. That is the tragedy the myth insists on, a permanent, cautionary image of what happens when the capacity to originate one's own words is lost for good. But you are not a mythological figure serving a permanent narrative function. You are a living person, and the specific mechanism that took your no away, an early, adaptive, but now outdated survival strategy, is fully capable of being consciously revised. Think for a moment about the specific quality of relationships that actually deepen over a lifetime, and the ones that quietly hollow out despite an outward appearance of closeness. Relationships sustained entirely by one person's compulsive agreement rarely deepen into anything resembling genuine intimacy, because genuine intimacy requires two authentic people meeting each other honestly, including in their disagreements and their limits. A friendship, a partnership, or a family bond built on your unlimited, unexamined availability is, paradoxically, a much thinner and more fragile thing than one built on your honest, occasionally inconvenient presence, because only the second kind involves the other person actually encountering you, rather than a carefully maintained reflection of whatever they hope to find. Every time you locate a suppressed refusal through active imagination, every time you journal honestly about resentment you would once have swallowed silently, every time you tolerate the brief, survivable discomfort of a small real-world no, you are doing the quiet, unglamorous, absolutely essential work Jung called individuation, reclaiming one deliberate act at a time, the parts of your own voice that were taken from you before you were old enough to object. This work rarely announces itself with any dramatic turning point. It tends to arrive instead in small, almost unremarkable moments. A request declined without an accompanying essay of justification. A flicker of resentment noticed and honored rather than swallowed. A single honest sentence spoken where an automatic accommodating yes used to live. But these small moments accumulate, the same way the original good persona accumulated. One small compliance at a time, until eventually, often without any single dramatic realization, you notice that your yes has started to mean something again, precisely because your no has finally become available to stand beside it. The next time someone asks something of you, and you feel that familiar reflex rising, the immediate, automatic yes already, halfway out of your mouth before you have even considered the request. Try pausing, just for a moment, and asking yourself honestly what you actually want to say. The answer might surprise you. And in that brief pause, in that reclaimed half-second of genuine consideration, the long, quiet work of finding your own authentic voice, the voice that was always yours before the persona ever learned to speak for you, truly begins.